Well, we're all here. Thanks everyone for joining our panel. I'll start off by introducing everybody and we'll dive in. I'll start off with myself. I'm Nate Halverson. I'm a journalist here in the United States. I've been covering food and agriculture for about 7 years, starting with Shuangwei or WH Group's purchase of Smithfield Foods. I went and interviewed then Larry Pope, the then CEO, and then went to China and interviewed the head of Shuangwei or WH Group to understand why the Chinese were so focused on agriculture here in the U.S. And it was very informing. And I've been covering agriculture since. And I'm currently actually working on a documentary about the importance of food and how we're going to feed everybody in the 21st century and what happens if we don't get it right, with a Hollywood director, Gabriella Copperthwaite, to try to tell the world about what all of you know so well. So appreciate the opportunity to moderate this panel. And I've got Michelle Adelman here, and Michelle is the CEO of Accite Holdings, where she is focused on investing in plant-based food and hydroponics and other avenues focused on sustainability and technology. And I'd say specifically on reducing one of the key inputs of food production, water. And so we appreciate Michelle's time, and thank you, Michelle, for joining us this morning. And Nuradin is founder and CEO of Grosso Foods, an agribusiness investor focused on African markets, targeting everything from the farm to the fridge, if that's accurate. Yeah. And he was born in Somalia, raised in Holland, and got his start with Agco, the Holland company. So thank you, Nuradin, for joining us this morning. Actually, I keep saying this morning, I should disclose that I'm in Dallas and that it's very early in the morning, and for the rest of most of you, it's the afternoon. So I apologize if I keep saying good morning. Michelle, I'll start with you. Let me ask, just what attracted you to plant-based food?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I invest exclusively in food and ag tech, and our first major venture was in hydroponic controlled environment agriculture, which is all around solving Africa's supply chain problems around fresh produce. And if you, through controlled environment agriculture, we've been able to, in Botswana, reduce water usage, but also take the spoilage out of our supply chain. So presumably, having piloted a solution for solving fresh produce supply chain issues, for me, the next big challenge for Africa is protein. So, as a continent with a population growing, 2.5 times faster than the rest of the world, and protein consumption is increasing 4% per annum, we are effectively on a collision course with industrialized agriculture. So while most farming across the continent is smallholder farming and fairly regenerative in nature, if our demand for meat and dairy products continues to grow at the course that it's growing, we are going to fall into the trap that the Western markets have, and we're going to fall into a deeply industrialized agriculture system, which is, shown to be bad for the environment. We're seeing the effects of it with climate change, and frankly, consuming dairy on a continent where 75% of people are lactose intolerant, and consuming large amounts of red meat, nobody can argue that this is good for you and good for our health system. So I view plant-based foods as a really positive solution for Africa, because it allows us to go back to our traditional diets, which were largely plant-based. While we have a huge fascination with meat, and it's a very important part of culture, we're actually not very big meat consumers, either traditionally or today. We consume across the continent on average only 30% of the meat that an American would, for example. So plant-based food provides us an alternative path so that we can get protein, we can have tasty meat analog products, and we can do that in a way that will protect the environment and provide a healthy and sustainable food system.
And let me just ask you a quick follow-up. I mean, here in the United States, we have seen a pretty significant adoption of plant-based meat alternatives. I mean, Burger King now carries a plant-based hamburger, right? The Impossible Burger is now at every Burger King across the country. Every exit here in Texas, you can pull over and get one. and people are speaking quite favorably of them. But what are the challenges specifically, do you think, on the African continent for introducing and adoption of plant-based meat alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are three challenges. One is behavior change. I think everywhere around the world, it's hard to change what people's diet and their traditions are, but I find in particular, people are very tied to their traditional diets, and so changing people's behavior is one of the challenges. The second challenge is most of the latest products and the really good products are mostly been designed for an American or European diet. So it's hamburgers and chicken nuggets. And we don't consume meat in Africa as hamburger and chicken nuggets. We consume whole muscle cuts of meat, right, in a stew, in a curry, on a braai. So we need to see meat and dairy alternatives that come out that use the format of how people consume meat and dairy on the continent. And the third is price. So a lot of these, millions and millions of R&D money has been going into creating a hamburger that you can put at McDonald's or Burger King that really tastes like a hamburger. Right. And that money needs to be recouped. And so these products, in the beginning, at least right now, are certainly more expensive than their animal-based counterpart. We are seeing a dramatic decrease in costs on a year-over-year basis, and we expect that the price of these products will be on par with the price of animal-based meat and dairy within 4 years.
Nuradin, can I ask a question? When I started looking at agriculture and sort of, how the world is going to feed an additional 2 billion people or 3 billion people by 2050. One of the things I came across was this World Bank document that said Africa is a key part of producing enough food to feed the world, and that it needs to become a net exporter of food, according to the World Bank. As the FAO says, we need to produce 70% more food by 2050. Can I just kind of gut check that with you? I mean, you are an expert in this field. When will Africa become self-sufficient in food production, and do you think it's realistic to consider that it will become a net exporter?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to you, Nate. You see, the Africa and agriculture is evolving. We first have to start from the value. Our company, we're trying to use the food as a 4 pillars. One, the F stands for us fair. So we have to look at first the African farmer. It's not a fair market because he's competing, Western market is subsidized farmer. See, you have US huge lobby for agricultural farmers. You have European Union, 50% of their funds going towards subsidized food. So that's a fair starting point, is to create a fair market. So currently the African farmer is not a price giver. It just takes price. The traders are actually the ones who are benefiting from the farmer. So what we are trying to do is first set up a fair price at the farm gate to make sure the farmer, he gets his produce the right price. That we know there is a clear prediction of the future trading of his crop. So instead of selling just for season, that we can actually introduce future commodity trading, for example, to make sure that the buyer or the trader knows the farmer's input, the cost of production, and to make sure the farmers get fair price. Secondly, the farmer has to be protected from imported food. So you can't produce something and invest the farmer and then allow the traders to come in the cheap product from, let's say, the subsidized market. So that's number one. Number two, we have to be open. When I say open, is currently Africa has no manufacturing of agricultural equipment, any form. I come from the manufacturing industry. Everything is today the farmers use it have to be imported and have to be transparent price. Currently, there is a lot of transfer price. For example, if a unit is produced, let's say in US, US manufacturer will sell to their subsidiaries in Europe. Everyone has Europe, Africa, Middle East region. Then will sell to an importer. The importer will sell to they will put their transfer price. So the pricing for the product that farmers get today in Africa is not clear. So we have to be very transparent on the cost of the manufacturing of the goods. The imports have to be produced locally. So currently, if you even build a chicken house in, let's say, in Tanzania, where I am now, you'll have to import almost all the material. Some of it can be locally produced. So manufacturing of the equipment is very critical. We are, despite all those two challenges, we are very optimistic about the future. The future, I'm very optimistic because now we can actually link the whole value chain to make sure before it's planted, the farmer knows the price he will get at the end of the season, to make sure there's a proper storage, and then bring the product added value. So we have to look at what product that we're going to produce. So if you take the cash crops, we're very good at it. If you look at coffee, tea, very successful stories there in some part of Africa. Cacao, despite just 70% of the world production, is still exported. But there are other crops that are, like for example, if you take sunflower oil, it's the least traded commodity in Africa. So can you imagine that the continent Africa can produce sunflower easily? So we have to promote the products that are easier for the African to produce, and two, can be consumed locally. And then we have to promote other crops that are very profitable crops, like blueberry, for example. We are seeing the huge demand on blueberry from Africa. So today, Zambia is exporting to UK. If you go to Lidl supermarket, you will find blueberry from Zambia. And we're seeing also Zimbabwe tapping into that area as well. So there are crops that are the world is demanding for these crops, and there's opportunities. Lastly, we need to have the policy maker a decisive decision. To get a land in Africa, sometimes it's very progressive. So we have to also support with the government to make the policies that are very decisive for the farmer, the benefit of the farmer. So in a nutshell, if we address at early stage the education part, promoting agriculture is something that we should go to university history. That's the biggest problem. Less than 2% all graduates in Africa is studied agriculture. So everyone there today, if you want a farm manager, it's hard to find farm manager. You may go to Zimbabwe, you may go to South Africa, but how do we get agriculture promotion of very young population in Africa? How do we make it agriculture? The only way to do that is to look at the salary. Far more than today, we state salary, you take even agriculture industry. So the young people today want to be marketing, want to go study some other. So we have to come up with a solution to get young people to go to study agriculture. I'll stop there.
Nate, can I
Yes.
build on that? I mean, I think there are 2 points that I'd love to add on to what Nuradin is saying.
Please.
The other thing that we're missing, besides fair price and policymakers and the points that he laid out, is that we also need to have mission-driven businesses that are effectively pulling the farmers into the value chain. A lot of the work is trying to improve farmers' yields and productivities, but if they're selling commodity crops to cartels, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can be a lot more. Your yields can be a lot better, but you're not really improving people's livelihoods. So I think we need to look at our entire food value chain, and especially food processors. And we need mission-driven businesses, and that's what we're hoping to build with Infinite Foods, who can pull farmers into the value chain in an ethical way and ensure that farmers are being paid a fair wage. I think the other thing is we need to make sure we don't fall into the fallacy that food production and food exports equals food security. If you look at the Economist Intelligent Unit Food Security Index, there's only 2 countries in Africa that are in the top half, and that's South Africa and Botswana. And nearly of the bottom 40 quartile, the 30 countries in the bottom quartile, 23 of those countries are from Africa. And of those 23 countries, in the bottom quartile of the Food Security Index, 4 of them are net food exporters. So, Malawi, Zambia, Ethiopia, Tanzania are all net food exporters, and yet are in the bottom quartile when it comes to domestic food security. So we need to make sure we don't confuse these two issues. If we want to create domestic food security, we need to be able to grow and produce nutritious food that can feed nations. And that is almost a totally different way of thinking than what you're doing in terms of economic diversification and growing food for export and for value creation.
Yeah, I think the interesting question going forward is going to be, I mean, you both very sensibly are looking at this from the holistic standpoint, in that you can't solve one problem without also, let's say, having manufacturing, agricultural manufacturing in line, and having the various inputs in line within the economic sector, and supporting the farmers so that they're growing. But at the same time, we see these macro trends across the globe of people eating more protein still, of the populations growing. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, it almost is a little bit of a race to see whether the impacts of the other macro trends outpace, or if, as Nuradin was describing, these more holistic, large systemic changes fall into place to support the agriculture in Africa. And to that sort of laying that out, I mean, one of the things we saw here in the United States anyway, when the pandemic first started, was this rush to grocery stores where the shelves were cleared out. There wasn't flour, there wasn't dried beans, rice was gone. And this was in a time of if you look at global production, it was really a time of plenty, and yet the grocery store shelves were running bare. I'm kind of curious from your perspective, and from sort of this panel's agenda of looking at future problems and opportunities, where do you see the future next shock to the food system, and how can farmers and food operators in Africa be ready for it, and be ready to sort of take advantage to be well placed to meet that next issue?
Yeah, if you take, for just to add, Michelle, what earlier said, the farmers in Africa yields, if you increase, it's detrimental to their business, because the traders will reduce the price, they buy from the farmer. So the farmer has to keep the production quite low to keep the price stable. Otherwise, any increase from years, you will see immediately effect on the price falling. So that's one thing that I just want to add to the earlier point Michelle made. But just coming back right now, what we are doing, example, I came here around January. I came here 2 months time off from work, and I get stuck here on my way to South Africa. I was living in Joburg, and since then I haven't gone back, so I stayed on in Tanzania. And we are actually launching our company in the next 2 weeks, and we're going to launch a company that focuses on sisal. And I give you an example. Sisal came into this country 1893, been very successfully integrated into the economy of the agricultural sector. Then you have 5 large companies that control the majority of the business exporters, and you have thousands small-scale farmers been trained to grow sisal. And the good thing about sisal is a kind of lazy crop, because you plant once, and it's a life cycle of 8 to 12 years, depending on which seed you use. But on average, the yields that you cut from year 3, one seed once, and year 4 goes up. But there is a bottleneck in the processing plant, and the farmers are actually cutting 50% what they're supposed to cut, let's say, on average 4 times in the life cycle of the production. They're cutting today too. And they're even actually going down, because you've got very small processing plants. It's a manually used plant. You cut manually, transfer to you take the fiber out, and only 2% of that plant is used. 98% is dropped. And compared to that agave in South America, you find, everybody knows tequila is made up with the same product. In sisal, agave is the same product. So if you look at agave sugar, everybody is aware, but nobody's actually looked into that. The farmers are there, the plants are there. and the farmers today are struggling to feed themselves just using, not even getting the yields what they've already achieved, the plant grows season. So our aim is now to set up the first plant that will actually increase the production capacity for the small-scale farmer. Make sure that he gets the cuts he needs seasonally to improve from 50% to 100%. Within the next 6 months, we are planning to set up our plant in Tanga region. Secondly, we are already working on extracting for sugar, nectar sugar. So we have got all the design and trying now to raise funding for tequila, the next step. So we have identified it's farmers that are already organized, structured, cooperative in place, but the system requires to look into in depth and find what can we add and that will change the whole value chain. So we have to analyze all the crops. If you take, for example, soya, soybean Malawi is feeding most of the southern part of Africa. Malawi is the one actually exporting soya. But if you look at Malawi population, food nutrition is also that. But unfortunately, we have to keep those products in Malawi, the soya, make soya edible oil, just take the cake, make animal feed. But the process, the yields, the crops, commodities are there, but it's just missing the link to add value. And that's where we, as a Grosso Foods, trying to tap in existing farmers, existing plants, existing yields. We just want to really improve the farmer so that he can earn a bit more from existing crops he's growing today.
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what Nuradin is saying, I think there are, one of the hard things about these panels and discussions is it's very hard to take a broad brush across Africa. There isn't, one Africa. There's 54 Africas in sub-Saharan Africa, and the environment is much different from a retail perspective depending on where you are on the continent. But I think I completely agree. I mean, there is we're sitting on 25% of the world's arable land, but only 10% of the yield. And in many ways, I think we're at an inflection point where people are really looking differently at food globally, and they're looking differently at food supply chains. And I think our traditional lack of organization and, the little bit of chaos that is our agricultural system can actually be our strength in this regard, right? And I'll just go back to plant-based foods as an example, right? If we're going to eat our hamburgers made out of pea protein and our eggs made out of mung bean and our milk made out of oats, well, somebody's got to grow the peas and the mung beans and the oats. And the US and European agricultural machines are not really tuned to kind of spin on a dime and go into a new direction. Now, how farmers, there's only 2% of farmers in the US now compared to 60% in Africa. And those farmers make money in a very prescribed way. And a lot of it is tied to the ethanol market and raising corn for ethanol versus even tied to the food market. So I think we're sitting on an opportunity where our lack of structure could be a strength, because if we can have the policy and leaders with the foresight to get ahead of these movements, we can become the leaders in growing these new types of crops that are the inputs to the food of the future. So I think that's one important thing. I think the other thing, talking about COVID, that we've seen that's very interesting is the acceleration of new business models. So, we lag really behind in last mile cold chain capability and in e-commerce across the continent. And even in South Africa, which might be one of the more sophisticated markets, e-commerce and direct delivery of groceries or farmers' baskets or these types of things are really immature still. And I think what we saw during COVID is kind of the rapid prototyping of a whole bunch of new direct-to-consumer solutions. And I think that if we can continue to look at these new business models, and with COVID as a backdrop, gives us a good excuse to go out and try stuff. I think that'll also change a bit the power shift of how producers and processors can get access to farmers and how farmers can create value, and how consumers can get access to healthier produce that hasn't been handled as much, that isn't as old, and therefore is more nutrient rich. So I think COVID has definitely seen an acceleration of new business models, especially technology-enabled e-commerce and supply chain capability.
Well, as is always the case, we feel like we're just getting started in the conversation and time is running out on us. So I will ask you both a final question, if that's okay. I would just be curious. I mean, both of you have these beautiful, ambitious plans with your businesses. And so, Michelle, I'll just start with you at the same question. It's what is the enemy of your dream? What keeps you up at night?
The enemy of my dream. I think the enemy of my dream is time. And we need to be able to move fast, right? If we're going to take advantage of these trends, and we're not fast, right? We can be quite slow across the continent. And I think we've got to have more of an entrepreneurial spirit and be able to move our way through bureaucracy and action more than anything else. And I think we need to continue to invest in education, because we need a young population, we need our youth to have math and science skills if they're going to thrive in a technology-enabled agriculture and food world. And we need to continue to make sure that we've got the human capital talent that we can tap into to take advantage of these opportunities and turn them into reality.
Nuradin, I'd ask you the same question. What is the enemy of your dream? What keeps you up at night as you start your business up?
Yeah, so the enemy of me is this transfer price. You know, when I set up an 800-acre farm in West Kilimanjaro and managed to buy some equipment locally. So I come from the manufacturing side. I know exactly what tractor or combine can produce. So we are looking at the product, markup of 150% on the finished product, and spare parts we're looking at about 1,000, 1,200 on average markup price. So that's really what keeps me awake, is how we find a solution that we manufacture through engaging the manufacturers to be more transparent on how they deal with the African market. I've tried myself with this. The challenge is we don't use technology, and the manufacturers, they're not willing to invest or bring the technology into Africa because the industry is small. So how do we get the manufacturers, give them the confidence to come to Africa with the right technology, but with right pricing, without going to many transfer prices outside the continent before it arrives to the farmer. As a farmer trying to farm myself, that's what keeps me awake, is the cost of the input. It's just too high.
And I guess that gets back to the large systemic changes, the holistic changes that are needed to bring those prices down and bring those input costs down. Well, I thank you both so very much for being on this panel. It flew right by. I loved it. Hopefully I have the opportunity to meet you in person sometime so we can do something like this up on a stage together rather than thousands and thousands of miles apart.
Thank you. Thank you very much.